We will now be reading second part of Letters from a Father to His Daughter, written by Jawaharlal Nehru. Second, how early history was written. In my letter to you yesterday, I pointed out that we have to study the early story of the earth from the book of nature. This book consists of everything that you see around you: the rocks and mountains and valleys and rivers and seas and volcanoes. This book is always open before us, but how few of us pay any attention to it or try to read it. If we learned how to read it and understand it, how many interesting stories it could tell us. The stories we would read about in its pages of stone would be more interesting than a fairy tale. And so, from this book of nature, we would learn something of those far off days when no man or animal lived on this earth of ours. As we read on, we shall see the first animals appear, and later more and more animals. And then will come man and woman, but they will be very different from the men and women we see today. They will be savages, not very different from animals. Gradually, they will gather experience and begin to think. The power of thought will make them really different from the animals. It will be a real power which will make them stronger than the biggest and fiercest animal. You see today a little man sit on top of a great big elephant and make him do what he wills. The elephant is big and strong, far stronger than the little mahout sitting on his neck. But the mahout can think, and because he can think, he becomes the master and the elephant is his servant. So he thought grew in man, he became cleverer. So as thought grew in man, he became cleverer and wiser. He found out many things: how to make a fire, how to cultivate the land and grow his food, how to make clothes to wear and houses to live in. Many men and women used to live together, and so we had the first cities. Before the cities were made, men used to wander about from place to place, probably living in some kind of tents. They did not know then how to grow their food from the land. They had no rice therefore, nor did they have any wheat from which bread is made. There were no vegetables, and most of the things you eat today were not known then. Perhaps there were some wild nuts and fruits which men ate, but mostly they must have lived on animals whom they killed. As cities grew, people learned many beautiful arts. They also learned how to write. But for a long time, there was no paper to write on, and people used to write on the bark of the bhojpatra tree. I think this is called the birch in English, or they wrote on palm leaves. Even now, you will find in some libraries whole books written in those far off days on the leaves of the palm tree. Then came paper, and it was easier to write. But there were no printing presses, and books could not be printed off in their thousands as is done today. A book could only be written once and then copied out by hand laboriously. Of course, there could not be many books. You could not just go to a bookseller or a bookstall to buy a book. You had to get someone to copy it, and this took a long time. But people in those days wrote beautifully, and we have today many books in our libraries which were beautifully written by hand. In India, we have especially books in Sanskrit and Persian and Urdu. Often the man who copied the book made flowers and drawings on the sides of the page. With the growth of cities, gradually countries and nations were formed. People who lived near each other in one country naturally got to know each other better. They thought they were better than others who lived in other countries, and very foolishly they fought with these others. They did not realize, and people do not realize even now, that fighting and killing each other is about the most stupid thing that people can do. It does good to nobody. To learn the story of these early days of cities and countries, we sometimes get old books, but there are not many of these. Other things help us. The kings and emperors of old times used to have accounts of their reigns written on stone tablets and pillars. Books cannot last long. Their paper rots away and gets moth eaten, but stones last much longer. Perhaps you remember seeing the great stone pillar of Ashok in the Allahabad fort. On this is cut out in stone a proclamation of Ashok, who was a great king of India many hundreds of years ago. If you go to the museum in Lucknow, you will find many stone tablets with the words engraved on them. In studying the old history of various countries, we shall learn of the great things that were done in China and Egypt long ago, when the countries of Europe were full of savage tribes. We shall learn also of the great days of India when the Ramayana and Mahabharata were written, and India was a rich and powerful country. Today our country is very poor, and a foreign people govern us. We are not free even in our own country and cannot do what we want. Then there's an image of a fossil plant in one of the pages. I can figure out there's one stone and there's a plant which is embedded in it, so it's a fossil plant. We continue our reading. But this was not so always, and perhaps if we try hard, we may make our country free again, so that we may improve the lot of the poor and make India as pleasant to live in as are some of the countries of Europe today. In my next letter, I shall begin this fascinating story of the earth from the very beginning. The third letter, the making of the earth. You know that the earth goes round the sun and the moon goes round the earth. You know also perhaps that there are several other bodies which, like the earth, go round the sun. All these, including our earth, are called planets of the sun. The moon is called a satellite of the earth because it hangs onto it. The other planets have also got their satellites. The sun and the planets with their satellites form a happy family. This is called the solar system. Solar means belonging to the sun, and the sun being the father of all the planets, the whole group is called the solar system. At night you see thousands of stars in the sky. Only a few of these are the planets, and these are really not called stars at all. Can you distinguish between a planet and a star? The planets are really quite tiny, like our earth, compared to the stars, but they look bigger in the sky because they are much nearer to us. Just as the moon, which is really quite a baby, looks so big because it is quite near to us. But the real way to distinguish the stars from the planets is to see if they twinkle or not. Stars twinkle, planets do not. That is because the planets only shine because they get the light of our sun. It is only the sunshine on the planets or the moon that we see. The real stars are like our sun. They shine of themselves because they are very hot and burning. In reality, our sun itself is a star. Only it looks bigger as it is nearer, and we see it as a great ball of fire. So that our earth belongs to the family of the sun, the solar system. We think the earth is very big, and it is big compared to our tiny selves. It takes weeks and months to go from one part of it to another, even in a fast train or steamer. But although it seems so big to us, it is just like a speck of dust hanging in the air. The sun is millions of miles away, and the other stars are even further away. Astronomers, those people who study the stars, tell us that long ago, the earth and all the planets were part of the sun. The sun was then, as it is now, a mass of flaming matter, terribly hot. Somehow, little bits of the sun got loose and they shot out into the air. But they could not wholly get rid of their father, the sun. It was as if a rope was tied to them and they kept whirling round the sun. This strange force, which I have compared to a rope, is something which attracts little things to great. It is the force which makes things fall by their weight. The earth, being the biggest thing near us, attracts everything we have. In this way, our earth also shot out from the sun. It must have been very hot, with terribly hot gases and air all round it. But as it was very much smaller than the sun, it started to cool. The sun also is getting less hot, but it will take millions of years to cool down. The earth took much less time to cool. When it was hot, of course nothing could live on it. No man or animal or planet or tree. Everything would have been burnt up then. Just as a bit of the sun shot out and became the earth, so also a bit of the earth shot out and became the moon. Many people think that the moon came out of the great hollow which is now the Pacific Ocean between America and Japan. So the earth started to cool. It took a long time over it. Gradually, the surface of the earth became cooler, although the interior remained very hot. Even now, if you go down a coal mine, it becomes hotter and hotter as you go down. Probably, if you could go down deep enough inside the earth, you would find it red hot. The moon also started to cool, and because it was much smaller than even the earth, it cooled more quickly than the earth. It looks delightfully cool, does it not? It is called the cold moon. Perhaps it is full of glaciers and ice fields. When the earth cooled, all the water vapor in the air condensed into water and probably came down as rain. It must have rained a tremendous lot then. All this water filled the great hollows in the earth, and so the great oceans and seas were formed. As the earth became cooler and the oceans also became cooler, it became possible for living things to exist on the earth's surface or in the sea. We shall discuss the early beginnings of life in the next letter. This is letter 4, the first living things. We saw in our last letter that for a long time the earth must have been too hot for any living thing to exist on it. When did life begin on the earth, and what were the first living things? That is a very interesting question, but it is also a very difficult question to answer. Let us first consider what life is. You will probably say that men are living beings and so are all animals. What about trees and shrubs and flowers and vegetables? Surely they are living also. They grow and drink up the water and breathe the air and die. The chief difference between a tree and an animal is that the tree does not move about. If you remember, I showed you some plants in Kew Gardens in London. These plants, orchids and pitcher plants, actually eat flies. Then there are some animals like sponges which live at the bottom of the sea and do not move about. Sometimes it is very difficult to say whether a thing is an animal or a plant. When you study botany, the science which deals with plants, or zoology, the science of animals, you will see these strange things which are neither wholly animal nor plant. Some people tell us that even stones and rocks have some kind of life and that they feel a kind of pain. But it is difficult to see this. Perhaps you remember a gentleman who came to see us in Geneva. His name is Sir Jagdish Bose. He has shown by experiments that plants have a great deal of life, and he thinks that even stones have some life. So you see, it is not easy to say what thing is living and what is not. But let us leave out stones for the present and consider only plants and animals. We have today a vast number of living things. They are of all kinds. There are men and women, and some of these are very clever and some are fools. Then there are animals, and among them too you find clever animals like the elephant or monkey or ant. You find also animals who are very stupid. Fishes and many other things in the sea are lower down, still in the order of life. And right at the bottom of this order, you find sponges and jelly, like fishes, and those things which are half animal and half plant. We have to try to find if all these different kinds of animals suddenly came into existence at one and at the same time, or gradually, one by one. How are we to find this? We have no regular books of those ancient times. But can our book of nature help us? It does help. We find in the old rocks bones of animals. These are called fossils, and when we find them, we can say that when that rock was formed long ago, the animals whose bones we have found must have lived. You saw many fossils of this kind, big and small, at the South Kensington Museum in London. When an animal dies, his soft and fleshy parts go bad very quickly, but his bones remain for a very long time. And it is these bones that we find and which tell us something of those animals of far off days. But suppose an animal has no bones, like the jellyfish. It will leave nothing behind when it dies. When we examine the rocks carefully and collect all the old fossil bones that we find, we can see that different kinds of animals lived at different periods. They did not all come together from nowhere. At first, there are very simple animals with shells, shellfish, for instance. The beautiful shells you pick up at the seaside are all the bony coverings of animals who have died. Later, we find more complicated animals, snakes, enormous beasts, bigger than our elephant, and birds and animals, resembling those we have today. Last of all, we find remains of man. So it appears as if there was a certain order in the appearance of animals. At first, the simplest animals, then a higher type of animals getting more and more complicated. So it appears as if there was a certain order in the appearance of animals. At first, the simplest animals, then a higher type of animals getting more and more complicated till we reach what is called now the highest type of animal, man. How the simple sponge and shellfish developed and changed and improved themselves so much is a most interesting study, and perhaps some day I shall tell you about it. But at present, we are concerned with the first living things. Probably the first living things when the earth cooled down were soft jelly like substances without any shell or bones and living in the sea. We have no fossil remains of these because they had no bones, and so we have to guess more or less. There are many jelly like things like these in the sea even today. They are round, but their shape is continually changing as there is no bone or shell. They are something like this. There's a picture given actually. There are three pictures. It looks like an amoeba, irregular in shape, and you can imagine it as a circle which is irregular in shape. We continue reading now. You will notice the spot in the center. Yes, also in the irregular circular shape that we have, there is a circle in the middle. We continue. You will notice the spot in the center. It is called the nucleus, and it is a kind of heart. These animals, or whatever they are, have a curious way of dividing and becoming two. They start getting thinner at one place and go on doing so till they break off into two jelly like things. And both of these are just like the original one. This division takes place after this fashion. So there is this irregular circle, and it looks like water, and then it's dividing into two by expansion, or it's splitting, and then it divides. You will see that the nucleus or heart also divides, and each part gets a bit of it. In this way, these animals go on dividing and increasing. Something of this kind must have been the first living thing on this earth of ours. What a simple and humble representative of life it was. There was nothing better or higher in the whole earth then. The real animals had not come, and man was not to come for millions of years. These jelly-like things were followed by seaweeds and shellfish and crabs and worms. Then came fishes. We know a lot about these as they had hard bony parts or shells, and they left these for us to find so long after them and to study them. The shells were left in the mud on the sea floor. They were covered up by fresh mud and sand and were so preserved carefully. The mud became hard because of the weight and pressure of the sand and mud on top of it. It became so hard that it became a rock. In this way, rocks were formed at the bottom of the sea. An earthquake or something else brought out the rock from under the sea, and it became dry land. Then the dry rock was washed away by the rivers and by rain, and the shells which had been hidden in it for ages and ages came out. This is how we came across. This is how we come across these shells or fossils, and after studying them, find out what our earth was like in the old days before man came. We shall consider in the next letter how these simple animals developed and became what they are today.